Greetings from Niagara Falls. One of the most important human emotions is empathy. Do you all agree? One fine way to develop empathy is to travel. When we travel, we get to experience diverse places, whether it's a mountain or a restaurant. For many months, for some, now it will be 2 years, we've not been able to travel. We've had to stay local. And so another significant way to nurture empathy is community. Through community, we come to experience diverse people. Travel, diverse places. Community, diverse people. Just look around. The diversity of how people look. And if you know some of the people, you know their backgrounds are even more diverse. I welcome all of our community for this evening's workshop. I specifically welcome our mentors and our mentees from our Wellness Mentorship program. This month, we celebrate our 10th month. We've been together for a long time. We're already planning what we're going to do in our second year of this program. Over the past 10 months, we've had diverse workshops. Some have been facilitated by those whose profession that workshop is, like managing perfectionism. Some workshops have been facilitated by our team. They're also professionals, but in a different way, like managing stress. This month, we are going to experience one of our most important workshops. We can live with the burden of perfectionism. We can live with the burden of stress. We cannot live without the earth. The earth comes before stress and perfectionism, correct? Our relationship with the environment must change. And I'll give you a reference for this. We're celebrating Vijayadashami, we're celebrating Devi. Have you observed that Devi Parvati's Vahana, which in English means vehicle, maybe another way to think of it is pet. Devi Parvati's pet is a tiger. What about Bhagwan Shiva? What is his Vahana? Share with me in the chat. It is a bull. Tigers eat bulls, no? That's a problem with livestock in near jungles. Fine. Let's reference their kids. Bhagwan Kartikeya. What is his Vahana or his pet? I believe it's a peacock, correct? And what about his brother, Bhagwan Ganesha? What is his Vahana? A mouse. I believe peacocks eat mice, yes? So what kind of family is this? When humans live in harmony, then all of creation lives in harmony also. That is the depth of Sanatana Dharma's message towards our earth. This is all I have to share. Our team will now introduce our professional facilitator, whom I'm very happy to know personally and learn from. Team, continue.
Hey, everyone. I'm really excited about our speaker today, Prakash Bhave, who is a CSK out of Raleigh, North Carolina. We've served at Chinmay Mission Raleigh-Durham for several years together, where he's known for his jam sessions with Chinmaya Saranjali. He has extensive experience in the environmentalism space. He graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in environmental engineering science and completed his PhD at Caltech with an emphasis on air pollution. He went on to work at the US EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, for over 10 years and later gained international experience working as a senior air quality specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in Kathmandu, Nepal. He informed me that this is sort of like the EPA for the Himalayas. Currently, he's working at Duke University as an environmental research scientist, and he teaches applied math at NC State University. So I'll now hand it over to Prakash. Hariom.
Hariom. Hariom to everybody this evening. My salutations to Vivekji. My thanks to Lavanya and the rest of the CSK team for putting on this excellent series of workshops, which I'm humbled to be part of today. Let's see if I can do the technology here. And we're going to go with F5. No. Yay. All right, so today's topic is climate change and sustainability. And in putting together this presentation, I thought about it from a personal journey, the personal journey of myself, and how I have been trying to improve my relationship with the environment and reduce my impact on it over the last several decades. And so today, what I'd like to share with you is that journey, and to talk about specifically what are some effective actions that we all can take as individuals to reduce climate change and to live more sustainably on this earth. So we're bombarded in the media by images like these. So we're all very familiar with the effects of climate change. Certainly anybody who's been watching the news, or even if you've been in school or college, anytime in the last 15 years, it's penetrated into our curricula. Climate change, as it used to be called commonly global warming when I was in high school, and we realized over a long time that term gets misinterpreted severely. And so now the term that we try to use more is climate change, because basically it makes the hot days hotter, the cold days colder, the rainstorms wetter, more severe, the droughts more prolonged, heat waves, cold snaps, and very recently, wildfires have been on the rise in our warmer parts of our country and around the world. What about sustainability? Well, it also, these are some images, picture of mountaintop mining, destruction of the earth. In immense amounts of trash built up here in this dumping area in Delhi. Scarcity of clean water. Lack of, deforestation for grazing as well as for lumber, and then loss of biodiversity. So we know the effects of climate change are very bad, very real. We also know the effects of living unsustainably are very, very detrimental. And when we think about this in a spiritual context, we recognize that both of these problems, climate change as well as unsustainability, work against our dharma, and they work against our life purposes. Over here on the right is a picture of my mom many, many years ago. And about 10, 12 years ago, she was in this class, or a class just like this, the 2-year Vedanta course in Sandipani Ashram in Mumbai. And she learned a great deal, like all of our teachers, acharyas, swamis do. After she finished the course and she had some time to reflect, one day she was talking with me and she said, Prakash, you know, there's two purposes of your life. And my ears perked up. She's always telling me little nuggets of information, but she said, well, this is what I learned in the ashram. The first is a biological purpose. It's to procreate the human species. And the second purpose is to eliminate your ego. And so this is one of the lessons that my mom taught me that has stayed with me. And naturally, if we continue to destroy the environment, destroy our natural resources, although we may be having more children and generations may be going on, they're going to have a harder and harder time living. But also, we recognize that as we get bombarded with these images about the effects of climate change, the effects of enormous amounts of waste generation, we start to feel internally that the inaction, not doing enough about these problems, causes agitation in our minds. And I think this is one of the reasons why the CSK team felt it was relevant for a wellness workshop. The question still remains, well, what can we do? What can we do about this? We don't want to be in inaction. We don't want to have this mental agitation. We want to do something to help solve these problems. And so that's what we'll try to talk about today in the form of a kind of a memoir, I suppose. And so I wanted to relate this topic with our last wellness workshop 2 months ago that was led really nicely by Om Chitale. And in that, one of the worksheets he gave us to do was this Action Continuum. And I adapted it for the purposes of this discussion. Let me see if I can poll the audience. Let's see, I'm going to mess this up, but let's give it a try. So I'll escape out of here, copy my question, and go back to Zoom. In the chat, please. Oh yeah, chat. In the chat, I've posted a question. And if you could look at that question and then place yourself on this continuum between 1 and 7. And you can just enter your answer in the chat, just so I get a sense of where we all are. Okay, great. All right, everyone's between a 3 and a 7. I didn't expect to see any 1s or 2s in this group, but a lot of us are on the right half of the spectrum. 5, 6s, wonderful. Somewhere between 5 and a 7. Amazing. Thank you. Let's see. Put this here. So tonight's workshop, of course, we're going to start at the 4, educating ourselves. I guess I'm doing the 5. And as part of Vivekji's Prithvi Seva Sangha, what we want to do is move ourselves rightward on this spectrum. So if you're at a 3, then congratulations for coming tonight and spending this hour. Get to yourself to a 4. If you're already at a 6, maybe hopefully we can move you to a 7. So move you along this spectrum. So let's start with a little bit of background. Oh, and I should have said one thing. Although today's talk was titled Climate Change and Sustainability, my background is more on the climate change end. I have a PhD, as Lavanya said, in air pollution. And so the emissions of greenhouse gases and such is more in my bag. So I'll be touching on sustainability, but focusing more on climate change. So what are the causes of climate change? There are the emissions of greenhouse gases. That's responsible for most of climate change. What's the magnitude of those emissions? Well, globally, we humans, we emit 46 billion tons of carbon dioxide and its equivalents to the atmosphere every year. And let's see, I wanted to ask if anybody wanted to guess, what were our global emission totals before industrialization, before we started burning fossil fuels tremendously? I guess we can type it in the chat. We got a guess for 100 million tons, 10 billion, 2 billion, 10 million. Wow, Maha, that's very close. Yeah, less than 2 million. Yes, yes, those who guessed really, really low are right. Before industrialization, our emissions globally were practically zero. Nearly perfect equilibrium between what we emitted to the atmosphere and what the biosphere and what our oceans took back. So, through photosynthesis, plants take up CO2. There are also a bunch of plants and algae in the oceans. They take up CO2, as do a number of marine organisms. And so we've come a long ways away from that. And that's why we have this buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the more it builds up, the more that these molecules trap the Earth's outgoing radiation, but they're transparent to the incoming radiation from the sun. And that's what causes the so-called blanket effect, or this greenhouse effect, where the atmosphere warms and warms. What about waste generation? Well, this graph here shows how much solid waste each of us produce every day. And unfortunately, I know Vivekji loves to talk about how Canada is so much better than the US, and they are a little bit better in this metric as well, but we lead the pack over all other countries in producing solid waste. The global average is, less than 1/3 of what we produce in our countries. It's great to see India, other developing countries are much below the global average. But as incomes rise, so does waste generation. So wealthier Indians are producing 7 times as much as poor Indians, a recent report showed. And this number is likely to grow as the Indian economy gets more into purchasing packaged goods, packaged food, and so forth. So suburbia, where many of us live, most of us probably grew up in many in US, suburban Canada. It took me a while to realize this. I started studying climate change in 1992 with the Rio Summit. Got really interested in it during high school when I was on the debate team, and then went on into studying it from my bachelor's and all the way into graduate school. 10 years into my work at the EPA, we started developing this so-called Green Book, trying to encompass kind of what we saw as sustainable principles for the United States, and how we should be looking at this. And the more I learned and thought about this issue of sustainability, the more I realized that our suburban communities are like a high carbon footprint trap. What do I mean by that? Well, in my home in Morrisville, where we lived when I worked at the EPA, it was a pretty large home, 3,400 to 3,800 square feet, something like that. which in North Carolina meant that we had to have a very active heating and ventilation system, heating throughout the winter, air conditioning throughout the humid summer in North Carolina. Furthermore, these suburban tracts of homes were far away from typically where people worked. We picked our home to be as close as possible to the EPA building, which was 5 miles away. But that still led to some vehicle emissions. I couldn't always ride my bicycle to work. Oftentimes I had to pick up children after school. And so that led to the requirement of driving. We were all purchasing packaged food from the grocery stores and then disposing of that. That's not only creating solid waste, but it's also, there's a lot of carbon emissions in the processing side when that raw agricultural commodity is being processed into the packaged food, just producing of the cardboard, the plastic wrapping, and so forth, the aluminum foil bags, all that emits a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases. And then we're purchasing merchandise that's basically designed for the dump, right? Either it's planned that way, like, you know, the iPhone is planned to become obsolete in time for the next iPhone to be released, or a perceived obsolescence of our goods that may be somewhat linked to keeping up with the Joneses, that, okay, I need to get the better lawnmower because everybody in my neighborhood has that, or whatever it might be. There's a lot of things designed for the dump or ending up in the dump. A great video on this that I recommend everyone to watch is The Story of Stuff. It's been up for over 10 years, so many of you have probably seen it. But what am I talking about, this carbon trap? Why is the suburbia a trap? What keeps us locked in these high emitting and high waste generating mode of living is, of course, the good schools that the suburbs are linked with, safe neighborhoods. And this is where all of our friends live. This is where our extracurricular activities for our children, for ourselves, is where Bal Vihar is. And so it's a trap. You know, we really can't get away from suburbia very easily. And so we kind of get locked into this high emitting modality. We'll come back to that trap later on. So this pie chart shows a breakdown of roughly what our household was emitting in terms of carbon CO2 equivalents. It was 83 tons per year, which is, I guess, a small number compared to the 40 billion tons a year that the world is emitting, but a large number nonetheless. And then this was calculated, by the way, using a real simple calculator. There are a number of calculators, and I'd recommend, if you haven't done this already, this is one easy way to get involved and get more educated about how much carbon you're emitting, is to calculate how much CO2 you and your household emit. This is based on our home in Morrisville 8 years ago, where we had, my wife and I and 3 kids, and had a higher than average annual income. So how does that compare? You know, put this 83 number in context with the rest of the US. There it is. More money you make, the more carbon you emit. That's pretty much a truth. So here's the Bhave household in 2013, emitting about 83 tons of carbon per year. And here's that magnet again, drawing us, right? Drawing us to earn more money, right? To bring us down this y-axis towards the bottom. But the unfortunate side effect of that is that it's also dragging us to the right and making us emit more and more CO2 and greenhouse gases. How do we compare with the rest of the world? Well, maybe no surprise here. Similar to the waste generation plot I showed earlier, the poorest countries in the world emit the least, the wealthiest countries emit the most. US and Canada near the top of the pack as usual. That little icon was to remind me. Oh yes. So having heard this much of our background, I think we were about 20 minutes in, I'm wondering if anybody wants to guess sort of where is Prakash headed with this? So we've calculated our emissions, we've compared our emissions in our household with others who earn different amounts of money and with others living in different parts of the world. Anyone want to take a stab? You can unmute and speak up. Nobody wants to. Ravi is going to unmute. Go ahead, Ravi. Oh, are we not allowing everybody unmute? Is there a lock?
So I think we would have to have them raise their hand, right, virtually, and then we can call on them, because I don't think everyone except the host can raise their hand or can unmute, if I had to guess.
Oh, okay, all right.
Ask folks to raise their hand and then we can unmute.
Okay, yeah, you can click the participant button and then the hand raise. Where is that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think, it's obviously revealing and scary from the information you've shared. So I'm hoping where you're going to go next with is kind of talk about ways, we can kind of help address the issue, at an individual level and also at a community level.
Yes, that is where I want to go. But my path there had a long detour, and so I'm going to share that with you now. But thank you, Ravi, for speaking up. Let's see if I can get back to sharing. Okay, so, well, I was, really frustrated with this, being in this trap, and let's see, in that, it didn't seem like there was any real easy way out of it, except maybe to move to a less or least developed country. And around this time when we were developing this green book at the EPA, we had a special visitor in Morrisville. Vivekji came to our house and stayed with us for a week. And during that week, I got front row seats. I got to observe a superb example of someone who was trying to live a lifestyle outside of the norm. Every night I would take Vivekji to the lectures, and then from the lectures on to the dinner bhiksha, and listen to how he would interact with people from various walks of life, and young, old, and in between. And that whole experience got our minds churning, mine and Neeta's, my wife. It started to get us to think about our desire to transcend the boundaries of our grihastha life, wanting to do more good for the world than we were doing. We felt like we should try to expose ourselves, become more worldly, like Vivekji was back then, and make our children more worldly, and also try to live happily with less, maybe decrease our carbon footprint, decrease our materialistic consumption. And so the way we did that was we decided to move our family to the developing world. And so April was when Vivekji visited us. By May, Neeta and I decided we're going to move overseas. We want to move to a developing country where there would be a lot of air pollution, so I would have something to work on, maybe make a bigger difference than I was able to make at the EPA. And then by July, started searching for jobs, informed my boss, the EPA, and other colleagues. By September, we'd sold our house. A friend of Neeta's, who's a real estate agent, said, if you really want to do this, you better sell your house in the summer when prices are high. So we went ahead and did that. And that was sort of like throwing our hat over the fence. Now we really had to move. We did experience the liberation of downsizing. Instead of a 3,400 square foot house, we moved into a 1,500 square foot townhouse. It was 3 stories. This was our whole living room, with all of what the kids used to have, a whole playroom in the house. That was all crammed in here. I think we used to have a home office. Now the computer was right there in the living room. We started getting rid of all of our furniture. Neeta made donations at Goodwill. We had a garage sale, sold a bunch of furniture on Craigslist. got the house sold. Luckily, there was a lot of offers at the time. And then we spent 3 years in Nepal. That was where I got a job in Kathmandu, as Lavanya mentioned, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. It's kind of like an EPA for the Himalaya Mountains. And I would have to say this was the most exciting work that I've gotten to do in my whole career. The kids got an excellent education at the British School of Kathmandu. We lived quite happily, I would say, with much less creature comforts. We had no running water. We didn't have electricity 8 to 14 hours a day, rolling blackouts in Kathmandu Valley for the first couple of years that we lived there. We all had a much healthier diet. We essentially ate no processed foods. This was the meal at the canteen in Isimode that I would have lunch, something similar to this almost every day. Dal bhat was the staple food. The only downside, I would say, to our time in Nepal was that we were exposed, we breathed a lot of air pollution, a lot of PM 2.5, fine particulate matter. Other than that, fantastic. I would recommend it to every one of our chicks and younger members in the audience. While you're still young and energetic, to go out and take an opportunity abroad like this. The bottom bullet here says that our carbon footprint was almost zero. And this little man was reminding me why it's almost. We did essentially have a zero carbon lifestyle on a day-to-day basis, biking, walking everywhere. And we had solar panels on the roof for heating our water, and the electricity all in Nepal, luckily, comes from hydropower, which is a zero carbon source of electricity. But the one little catch, the one place where we were emitting carbon still was in our air travel. And this is a huge greenhouse gas emitter that we don't often think about. When we buy that air ticket to go somewhere, the emissions from the airplane exhaust is huge. And during our 3 years in Nepal, we did travel a lot. We would travel to 9 different countries as a family, plus my work at Isimode took me to another 9 countries, as well as a number of trips to India by plane. After 3 years in Nepal, we made an attempt to level up, sort of to settle in the developing world, actually moved to Belagavi, Karnataka. By this point, our desires to travel and see new sites had completely sublimated. And so we could literally, theoretically move to Belgaum and live there. We got an apartment, and it's a small city halfway between Mumbai and Bengaluru, and just a little bit inland from Goa. It happens to be where my parents have settled after retirement, after my mom finished the Vedanta course. We bought a car, enrolled the kids in English school there. And my hopes were that we'd settle down in that town and that we could work on improving the local air quality with my expertise, with Nita's expertise, improve the local traffic. She's a traffic forecast modeler. And we could raise our kids there and continue to live sort of a zero carbon lifestyle. But unfortunately, that magnet came back. What was lacking in Belagavi that we didn't foresee before moving there was really high quality education for our kids. There was nothing quite like the British School of Kathmandu down in Belgaum. Very, very few foreigners actually in that town. And so that's the trade-off of living in a small town in India, is that education for kids is not nearly as good as in the bigger cities. But then in the bigger cities, you're breathing a whole lot more air pollution and traffic and other ills of that. My wife's career goals weren't being met. Extracurricular activities were very hard to come by. We enrolled the kids in badminton, and the badminton class for beginners was literally like, there was 2 courts, and one court was for the advanced 3 or 4 students, and the other court was for the other 30 beginners. And they would share that court over the course of an hour. I don't know, maybe hit the shuttlecock 5 or 10 times. We were also missing our friends. And so all these things essentially dragged us back to the US 3.5 years after we left. But we didn't go all the way back to our suburban trap. We had by this point evolved slightly in our thinking process, and so we settled in downtown Raleigh, not in the suburban Morrisville. We got this. We rented for a while and eventually bought this house. It's a much smaller house than what we lived in before, maybe 1/3 the size. And because by living in downtown, the kids were able to walk or ride their bicycles to school. Neetha and I could walk or ride our bikes to our offices. We got a Prius. Initially, we tried to live with just one car, and then after many Uber trips to Balvihar while Neetha was going to teach yoga at the temple, we ended up succumbing to needing 2 cars. So we got a second Prius. And then we'd also drive to soccer practice or whatever, soccer games in the suburbs, and to meet friends in the suburbs. The bottom line from all this storytelling is that our carbon footprint right now is pretty much as low as it can be while living in the US without having, number one, our kids resent us, like by moving them out to rural Oklahoma and living off the grid or something. And number two, without having my wife resent me, like moving someplace where she can't find a job. She is a city planner, so living in a city is kind of a requirement. Okay. Unfortunately, minimizing, reducing, almost zeroing your carbon footprint at the household level is not enough. Living in the US, that's just not enough to curb climate change and avoid all of those calamities that showed pictures of at the start. This graph is not really shown to scale, but let's be generous and imagine that my household emits, let's say half, or I think a little less than half of the average US household of our size, our income. But then if you look at the emissions from our country and divide it by the number of households, we'll find that that number is much, much higher. Why is that? Because there are a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that happen outside the household. Tremendous amount of upstream manufacturing of cars, microchips, light bulbs. I mean, everything. The shipment of goods to the country, the things that corporations purchase from one another in order to keep businesses running. All these things emit so much more greenhouse gases, and the estimates vary, which is why this plot is not to scale. But some estimates are that 70% of our waste that's produced in this country is produced by not households, but by industries. Something similar to 70% would be the greenhouse gas emissions. And so our gut reaction when we hear a statistic like that 70% statistic, is to look at whom to blame. Blame the corporations, blame the government, blame your least favorite policymaker or past president, whoever. But the truth is that no amount of blaming is really, there isn't one person that can solve this problem, but rather what we have in the US and in many countries, most countries in the world, is we have a complete market failure, a complete lack of our capitalist market to account for the so-called negative externalities that result when we burn fossil fuels, like all those heat waves and droughts and forest fires and floods and hurricanes. All those have a cost, but the cost of that is not being borne by the emitters of those greenhouse gases. And I could make it the exact analogous statement about the negative externalities of generating waste are not monetized. They're not part of our economy. And so this market failure is what really needs to be corrected in order to bring down the emissions of the entire country. And then there are clever ways to get the rest of the world, other countries in the world, to do the same. So how do we correct the market failure? Well, we have to put a price on carbon emissions, put a price on carbon. We can do that actually relatively easily. Well, not politically easily, but implementation's quite easy, because we don't actually have to go out and measure how much CO2 is being emitted by the tailpipe of my Prius or from the factories, because most of the combustion of fossil fuels that happens in the US is done so efficiently that every atom of carbon gets burned at such high temperature that it gets converted to carbon dioxide. 99.9, upwards of 99.9% of the carbon in any fuel, whether it's coal, oil, natural gas, jet fuel, kerosene, whatever, it's getting converted into CO2. And so all we need to do is put that price on carbon at the place where it's being drilled or mined from the earth or imported into the country. We just put essentially a tax on that carbon that's being imported or mined, with the full knowledge that eventually it's going to get combusted, and therefore we're basically pricing the carbon emissions. And it's really interesting. I've been following this. I've been actively involved in this Citizens Climate Lobby organization, and during the Q&A, I'll try to see if we can talk more about that. But this group has been instrumental in increasing the political will to put a price on carbon in the US. And now we have thousands of economists across the country, leading economists agree. Hundreds of mayors of major US cities agree. Business leaders from Shell Oil and ExxonMobil all the way down to breweries and local small businesses, chocolatiers and such, have endorsed this. Scientists, of course, agree. Even the Catholic Church has agreed that pricing carbon is effectively the most effective way to end this market failure and start and then thereby result in market pressures for each industry and each individual to reduce their carbon emissions. The price on carbon that's been proposed by CCL is $15 per ton of CO2 during the first year, and then ramp that price up by $10 per ton per year until fossil fuels are essentially priced out of the market. So basically put a predictable price signal in that businesses can plan for, and researchers can innovate alternatives to the fossil fuel burning. And then return all that revenue to American households in the form of a monthly dividend. So the overall term is called carbon fee and dividend. This is the solution that all these folks agree is the best way to curb climate change. And what does the dividend do? That gives everybody an equal share of the revenue from this carbon price, because as soon as carbon is priced, let's say at the wellhead where the natural gas is being drilled up in Oklahoma, then of course that price on carbon is going to be passed to the consumer. So we're all going to end up spending more money on our utility bill. We're going to spend more money at the gas pump. We're going to spend more money on some of our consumable goods, because to make those goods, carbon is being emitted, and so all those prices are going to go up. But then we'll also get a dividend check in return. It turns out, and you all know this now from the plot I showed earlier about the relationship between household income and carbon footprints, that poorer Americans emit a lot less CO2 than wealthier Americans. And so their dividend check, while it'll be the same as the rest of the countries, will be more than what they're spending on carbon fees. And so they'll actually benefit economically from this carbon fee and dividend, this carbon dividend. Whereas the wealthiest Americans, those in, let's say, the top quintile, the top 20 percentile of earners in the US, will end up losing a little bit of money because their carbon footprints are much, much higher. They're going to be ending up spending more on the carbon price than what the dividend check is going to return to them. But it turns out that the calculations show that that extra fee that they'll be paying on the carbon fee is relative to their dividend is only 0.2% of their income. It's still going to be a nuisance, a big enough nuisance that it'll nudge those high earners to take the actions that they are economically capable of, like putting solar panels on their roofs, or buying Teslas or other zero-emitting vehicles. Maybe paying for carbon offsets every time they get on a plane or go on a cruise ship, things like that. So if everybody agrees, why don't our politicians agree to put a price on carbon? There's a few reasons for this. Carbon taxes have been stigmatized in public opinion. Many of you remember, read my lips, no new taxes. Also, there's a lot of ignorance. There's ignorant people across the socioeconomic spectrum, from rich to poor, and across the political spectrum, from far left liberals to far right conservatives. One of the reasons, I won't get into all the reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that there has been a very, very large disinformation campaign over the last several decades, not just last few years or last administration. And I recommend anyone to read this book by Naomi Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt, that talks about how global warming, as it was previously called, the truth about it was totally obscured by a handful of paid-off scientists, just as they did with the addictive nature of tobacco smoking. Okay, let's see. Let's come back to the action continuum. So through this presentation, I'm sure you've all gathered kind of my personal journey across the spectrum. Maybe when I was in high school, I was probably a 3 when I first learned about the Rio Summit and what climate change was, what global warming was about, and got more into educating myself through my bachelor's, master's, PhD. During my work at EPA, I would be involved in educating others, primarily middle and high school students, about what causes climate change. Why is it that these molecules, these greenhouse gases, are transparent to incoming solar radiation but opaque to the outgoing Earth's radiation, causing this blanket effect? And then educating, maybe at a higher level, my research students and postdocs. Okay, what I hope is that by listening to this talk, that I'll convince many of you not to do the around the world detour that Neeta and I and our kids did to reduce your carbon emissions further. Of course, there were other numerous benefits and reasons for us to do that, but where I'd like to get us all is beyond encouraging people like myself. I get a lot of encouragement, and I'm very appreciative of it from members of our community, friends, family, for all the work that we've done to try to promote, let's say, carbon fee and dividend, or reduce our carbon footprint. But what I'd really love is for more and more of us to take an act in preventing and reducing these emissions. How can you do this? Well, one thing is we can join Citizens Climate Lobby. It's free to join. There are 250,000 volunteers now in every congressional district in the US. I would, let's see, let's stop my share here. I've gone and lobbied in DC. That's one way to do it. I've taken my daughter one year, my niece one year. Would love to take other members of the Chinmaya family to lobby our members of Congress and educate them about the importance of putting a price on carbon. But at the local level, there's other things that we can do. We can get endorsements for a carbon price, revenue neutral carbon price, not a tax, from our local businesses, the ones that we own, the ones that our friends own. Show our politicians that there is political will for an act like this, that it is bipartisan, that it's not something that the libtards or the tree huggers are in favor of. Write letters in your local newspaper, letters to the editor. Try to get your local editorial staff to write an opinion article, an op-ed that shows their support for a carbon price. Talk to, if you know the mayor. If you know someone who knows the mayor of the town that you live in, have your mayor contact your member of Congress. Persons of influence have a lot more weight in the ears of the members of Congress, whether in the House or in the Senate. And if they hear that, oh, our local leaders really would benefit from a carbon price like this, it'll help them achieve their goals of carbon neutrality or net zero. It can really help move the needle in the direction that we need it to go. In the chat, as I close, I would love to see what this discussion has struck in your mind as to what you think you can do to reduce your carbon footprint or to influence the reduction in the carbon footprint of our country, or any ideas that have come to you even may not have even been related to what I said about how you can reduce the amount of waste that you produce or the amount of material goods you consume. If you feel so inclined, you can type those in the chat, and I will close here and go back to Lavanya.
Yes.
Hariom.
Prakash, this was so great. I'm so glad you were able to join us. So much gratitude, and starting this conversation in our community. I think Vivek Ji had mentioned how innovative this is for us. This isn't something we, obviously talk about so extensively in our Chinmaya community. So we're all really energized to get involved, and for sharing your and Nita's inspirational story to inspire the rest of us and how we can start taking our steps, like you mentioned, in the Prithvi Seva Sangha. And Prakash has generously said that he'll stay after 10 o'clock for folks who have Q&A questions.
And now the main thanks to Prakash. I want to share a few ways that our community is rallying together to support what you've dedicated your life to. You yourself use the word Prithvi Seva Sangha. What our community is going to do differently for 2022, what we're going to do better is we're not just going to have Satsanga, but we're going to have Seva Sangha. And that is, we're going to commune to support our earth, our environment, our climate. And all the matches will do that. Every mentee, every mentor. Our community will do this. In 2022, our fundraising will be directed to environmental groups towards Prakash's work. Now, I think we raised $500,000 in 18 months. This is even more serious. If I can make this comparable, this is even more serious. So we should be able to do the same amount of fundraising for such work. And as I've shared with all of those who can change their careers, become a politician. This has to happen at a policy level. And I mean that most seriously. You're all smiling. Like I teach you Vedanta, you smile and nod and think it applies to someone else. I know you're doing the same in terms of me encouraging you to become politicians, but that's what we need, correct? We don't need more lawyers. We don't need more preachers. We need more politicians to enact such policy that is focusing on the substratum. We know Brahman is the substratum. Earth is also another substratum. So we're going to rally around what Prakash has shared right now. My appreciation to all of you for joining tonight. Tonight has been one of our largest workshops. I hope this trend will continue because the next workshops will be equally important. Next year will be equally important. I will chant Shanti 3 times. The first Shanti is for ourselves. The second Shanti is for those who are nearby us. We can call that family and community. The third Shanti, which is always the quietest, is for those who are far away. That is society, humanity. Included in humanity are animals and plants. In the chat, many sentiments have been shared about documentaries like Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, etc. So Shanti for all of our animals and our plants too. After that, Prakash will stay on. I know a lot of you have a lot of questions. You have ideas too. Prakash is the right person to validate those ideas or to guide those ideas. So formally, we're completing this workshop. Do stay on for more informal engagement. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be safe, be sound, be serene, be at peace. Anyone who has a question, please virtually put your hand up so there's an order. And it need not be a question. It could be a reflection also. There's lots of innovative personalities here. You may have an idea that can help someone else. So virtually put your hand up and we can proceed from there. To Prakash's point about living space, I remember when I was growing up, I have two siblings. All three of us slept in the same room. And our room was probably the size of some people's bathrooms now. And we were fine. I hope you think we're fine. And we're trying to nurture our children in the same way. This house is less than 2,000 square feet and we don't have a need for more space. All right, we're doing fine. Pratibha, go ahead.
Hari Om Vivek ji, and thank you Prakash ji. This was very revealing and very informative. I am very grateful that I joined this session. Just a quick reflection and a question, Vivek ji. So I was in a role which involved me travel to a lot of mining industry, and seeing directly what were the implications were very disturbing. So then I changed from the industry and moved to another industry. But what I realize is wherever we go, the impact is so much that it's so hard to stay away from not disturbing, without disturbing environment. How do we continue to do our work and still be dharmic and not disturb the balance that exists? So I'm trying to put my words in a way. I want to reduce the carbon footprint in the role in the industry that I work, but whichever industry that I go to, it's impossible to not contribute towards this. How do we stay dharmic and still, try to do our job in a dharmic way?
Prakash, that's you. She may have said me. This is not my class. I teach Pratibha enough, okay? So Prakash, all of these questions you have to answer.
Oh, wow. It's tough. So I was blessed for first 15 years of my career to be doing work that was for the benefit of the environment, right? At EPA, at ISI mode. But I recognize that that's a tiny fraction of the jobs that are available. And so I'm not gonna, advocate that everybody switch their job. And so how do we do this work in a dharmic way? So there are offset programs. So I guess step one, calculate your carbon footprint. You can do it in a very crude way with the website that I mentioned, but if you go on the internet, you'll find very detailed carbon calculators that, take how much natural gas does your household consume and how much miles do you put on your vehicle and how many, short, medium, and long trips do you go on an airplane and so forth. Identify how much you're contributing to the problem, and then reduce what you can, and then what you cannot reduce. Look into programs where you can basically pay to offset those emissions that you are emitting. What does that do? Well, when you pay for an offset, then the recipients of that will maybe do things like plant more trees. They will sequester more carbon from smokestacks. So before it's getting emitted, keep it out of the atmosphere. These solutions cost money, and offset programs are a way that individuals can can essentially offset their own personal carbon footprint or the footprint of their company. At the institutional level, you can do the same. When we were working at ISI Mode, our institute, of course, was very environmentally conscious. Even back in Nepal in 2015, was looking at, well, how, we send our employees all over South Asia to these meetings in China and Malaysia and so forth. And so the whole organization got involved in carbon in carbon offset programs, supporting, for example, sustainable tourism. Tourism is the biggest sector of the Nepali economy, and so that was ISI Mode's way of offsetting the emissions that it was aware that it was putting in the atmosphere. But the first step is consciousness, and the second step, I think, is reduce what you can and then offset what you can't.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to ask Ricky. There you go.
Hariom Prakashji, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, very insightful and very informative. I've got two questions. One is more on a practical standpoint. What are the most impactful lifestyle changes one can do to reduce the carbon footprint? Because I do hear about downsizing. I do hear about plastic usage. I also hear about investing in or looking at your investments and determining whether that money goes towards companies that pollute or don't pollute. I hear about Bitcoin being a very big culprit of creating emissions. So just putting all of these in sort of a scope, in your opinion, what are the most impactful lifestyle changes one can do for themselves? So that's one, that's personal. The second one is, could you maybe explain carbon pricing versus carbon tax? I hear those words as well, and each political party throws in these words in a different context. So maybe if you can spend a few minutes on that part as well.
Okay. Hariom, thank you, Ricky. Those are great questions. For the first question, what is the most impactful reduction that we can make? I'm going to recommend a book that I read, and I'm typing it in the chat. It's called How Bad Are Bananas? The name of the author isn't coming to me right now, but somebody else can probably add. That's a fantastic book. I read it cover to cover, and even with all of my knowledge about carbon emissions and air pollution emissions, I couldn't find any technical glitches in the author's calculations. So that's a really nice way. With the carbon footprint calculators, it's a little bit of a pain to figure out, well, what should I reduce in order to lower my carbon footprint, because you're putting all your inputs into one machine and then calculating your total. But with How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee, thank you, Soumya, you can identify what are the different major sources of your emissions. From my personal experience, what I find to be the most impactful ways to reduce our footprint, number one is to reduce our materialistic consumption. Buy less clothes, reuse clothes. You know, Nita and my kids and I, we love going to Goodwill and buying used clothing, reusing furniture that others are not necessarily throwing out on the curb, but that they have moved up to their attic and are no longer using. And then the second is, so these are sort of the, I guess we all commonly think about our vehicle emissions and our, how to reduce our, let's say, our heating and cooling. So I'm trying to think of two that are kind of off the radar. So one is reducing our consumption so that we're throwing away less stuff is going in the landfill. Repairing when we can repair things. And the second is to reduce our air travel. Air travel is a huge, enormous greenhouse gas emitter. And until the aviation industry comes up with ways to be more fuel efficient, we don't have a Tesla for airplanes yet, right? We don't have zero emitting airplanes. So that's to your first question. Second question was the differentiation between carbon tax and carbon fee and dividend. So carbon tax is regressive because everybody emits carbon, and if we tax those emissions proportionate to how much everyone's emitting, then the poor get hurt the most. Because even though their carbon footprint is tiny, their tax is going to be a larger fraction of their income than everybody else's, right? I talked about the top quintile of US earners. They'll only be spending 0.2% of their income on the carbon tax, whereas my neighbors here in downtown Raleigh will be spending 10 to 20% of their income if we simply tax it. Because their incomes are so low. So the carbon dividend is the key solution. We have to take all that revenue that comes from the carbon tax and not put it towards, first of all, not put it towards research or better light rail or high-speed transport or whatever, but rather return it all to the individuals and return it equally to everybody. In our bill, Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, or EICDA for short, we suggest that there's 1 share of a dividend is given to every adult, and then half a share to every child, with a max of 2 children's shares per household. So a household like mine with Nita, myself, and 3 kids would get 3 shares of that dividend. And the net result of this is that it actually benefits the poor economically, and that's why it's such a great solution, much better than a carbon tax.
Thanks so much, Ricky, for that. I'm going to unmute Akash so you can ask your question.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, first of all, for a great conversation. And it's my first time joining this group, and apologies for not being on a device that allows video calling. I wasn't prepared for that. I guess my main question is just kind of following through on what was presented today. You know, we've talked a lot about emissions, and but I'm curious about what we mentioned, like a collective consciousness. And my question is really, how do you best think we can kind of move towards that type of society or that type of population of people where this kind of materialism is not prized above environmental well-being? Or like what, like how can we kind of inspire, you know, future generation to really feel that way? Thank you.
Thank you, Akash. Akash was a colleague of mine at ISI Mode in Kathmandu. He's a Nepali national and now lives in Portland. And of course, he asks the tough questions. I'm not going to kid around with this, I guess. Ooh, Vivekji's got it. Okay. Encourage young people to, okay, thank you. Vivekji, why don't you take, yeah, that sounds good. So yeah, the motto is how to encourage the next generation. There, I guess, are many ways, you know, encouraging them to donate, like I did, take my daughter, my niece to lobby, make them more aware of this issue. Materialism, how do we get materialism to be less emphasized than environmental well-being? We unfortunately live in an economy where the value right now, the way that the society values you is based on how much you spend and how much you buy, and this has to change. How do you change that? I really don't know. I've been, you know, education seems to be, oh, I should have, yeah, let me reflect on this. When I came back from Nepal, when I moved back from India to the US, I was on a gap year. 3 months of the gap year was in Belgaum, and then the remaining 9 months was in Raleigh. And I thought about, well, what can I do to yeah, I didn't want to go back to the US EPA. Morale was very low over there, and plus they weren't doing anything about climate change. We have pretty clean air otherwise in the US. It's not in their mission actually to work on climate change because they're a domestic pollution environmental protection agency. But the two areas I thought that I could make the biggest impact was number one in education. So like you're alluding, teaching the youth. And then the second was in policy making. I thought about becoming a politician like Vikchi recommended, but Nita vetoed that right off the bat. So lobbying politicians was the next best thing. Sorry, Akash, I don't have a better answer to your question, but yeah, our economy is so, we've fought wars, right, for capitalism to be the way that the whole world should work. Undoing that without a war is going to be challenging. It was tried in Nepal, right? Akash, you were around when the Maoists rebelled against the king and tried to kind of make things more equal. But I don't advocate for that. So I'll stop blabbering.
Okay, our next question is from Mahati. You can unmute yourself.
Hariom Prakash Ji, Hariom Vivek Ji, Hariom everyone. I am a high schooler currently. I'm a sophomore and I live in Kansas. And I just wanted to reach out because I recently started a project at school working with some of my amazing teachers it's kind of a chemistry sort of engineering project that works on cleaning carbon dioxide essentially and separating the carbon and the oxygen to keep the pure oxygen and work with industrial carbon. And I would really appreciate your insight as this project develops, if that's okay with you. And I was wondering if there was any way that I could reach out to you. And I also wanted to know, throughout your talk, I realized that there was sort of a connection between income and our carbon footprint. And I just wanted to ask if income-wise, like I hope that earning money is still okay as long as we choose to keep a lifestyle that's sort of better for the environment, and so that we can also support nonprofits and other things that are part of the community to help better things. That was kind of my question. Thank you so much.
Mahati, congratulations on taking up that endeavor. I'm curious to learn more about your project, and I posted my email address in the chat. Anybody's welcome to write me on that address. And can continue the conversation there. As far as, yeah, I don't think, I'm not advocating to earn less. Earn as much money as you can, then spend it judiciously. Don't try not to spend it on material goods. I think every time you buy something new at the department store or at the appliance store, it's those invisible emissions are basically getting emitted out of your home, right? Remember that one of the last graphs that I showed, I said that 70% of the waste produced in this country, and roughly 70% of the emissions are going out because of industrial emissions. So this is because we're buying things. If we weren't buying that many things, then those emissions wouldn't be happening. And so we have to think about what can we do with that extra money that we'll earn, right? As by going for, try to get to high-paying jobs for sure, and then I guess what the answer is, maybe you pay for more services, you do more, you donate more, and I think buying goods has to really reduce.
Thank you so much, Prakash Ji. Hariom, everyone.
Great. Our next question is from Julie.
Hariom, and thank you for sharing all these things and also making this opportunity available, team. Appreciate it. Doing small things seems unrealistic in terms of, that's not going to make that much impact. So met a lot of people who just continue materialism or buying products because in total scheme of things, it doesn't add to anything because it's easier to blame others. Any suggestions how to approach that topic? And a sort of a second thought, it's gut reaction comes in where let there be a politician in somebody else's home, not mine. That's a very, very even Indian sentiment. Let there be a social worker or some other person in somebody else's family, not in mine. So it just, we get only certain types of politicians. That's what we create. So just pondering more on that. That's it.
Thanks, Julie. Good points. I guess for your first point about my emissions don't make a difference. If, and don't take this personally, but if folks in the audience can be at peace with that kind of a conclusion, it doesn't cause you mental agitation to be emitting at your full potential, buying material goods with the knowledge that you're harming the environment, then it's probably not, then I would say, yeah, continue with that. But I think, and I know that's true for this audience, is that it is causing us a lot of agitation. That's why we're here tonight, to hear about these the problem. I didn't even dwell on the problems. You hear about them all the time on the news: the forest fires, the sea level rise, the floods. Things are getting worse and worse, and there's no real turnaround point in the near future if we don't do something. And so I think the first step of trying to reduce our own emissions and offset our remaining emissions is to make ourselves feel good about feel at peace. To your second point, yeah, the gut reaction is, yeah, okay. You do your doctor, do your engineer job, and let someone else worry about politics. Interestingly, my first lobbying experience, November 2017, went to DC and lobbied 4 members of Congress in groups with the CCL organization, Citizens Climate Lobby. And every member of Congress that I met with was either Indian themselves or had an Indian member on staff. Okay, and so we've infiltrated the inner sanctum, Capitol Hill, right? We've infiltrated in many levels. Even the most far right Republican House of Representatives member, the staffer was a young Indian girl. On the other hand, in our sea of volunteer lobbyists, 700 strong at that meeting, I looked around the auditorium and I could count 2 people of Indian origin or South Asian origin, myself and one other. And so, I didn't change my job really to volunteer for CCL, but I started carving out time to go and do the lobbying or do more actions locally to increase this political will. And I think this is where our community is falling short, is that we're not active enough in this area because we feel like, oh, someone else will take care of it, or there's nothing that I can do that'll change these grander scheme issues. But actually, there's quite a bit. I've learned over the last few years, there's quite a bit that we can do. Every one of us can make a difference, make a dent in this problem. You don't have to go to DC and lobby members of Congress, but take your skill. Your local CCL chapter will find your superpower and identify how you can best help the organization achieve that important mission.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie, for the question. Thanks, Prakash, for that. We'll take our final question of the evening from Hamza.
Thank you, Sheetalji, and Hariom, to Prakashji, Vivekji, and everyone on the call tonight. It's been a very energizing conversation. I generally joke with my family that my bedtime is 9 p.m., so staying up for this is a real challenge, but this has been more than worth it. So I'm really happy to have spent this evening with you all. I just have one reflection and one question for you, Prakashji. My reflection is that I think a lot of us feel the sentiment that climate change and environmentalism feels so big that what do we as individuals really do that impacts it? And the way that I try to place myself in that question in that problem is that I cannot control everyone and everything, and I cannot control what the climate does today, tomorrow, and 20 years from now. But I do choose my actions every day. And if I'm doing everything that's conceivable and feasible for me in this moment, then I am doing my best. And that's how I try to move that forward. A simple example is I went to a family event and my cousin ordered too much food for the people who came, and she did not know a lot about food waste and was ready to throw all the excess into the trash. And I told her, like, absolutely not. The amount of energy we lose just by throwing good food into the trash is crazy. And so let's not do this. Let's put it into boxes. Let's pack it up. And we gave it to her neighbors. My family took some home. Other family members took some home. And we ended up not wasting anything that day. And yes, it was very small. It's just our family, but we did something that we were able to give to our neighbors, and we were able to enrich our lives, and we saved our cooking energy and all of that for 3 days after that. So it's really small, but it's really positive at the same time. And I think, you know, there were, I think at one point, 50 plus people on this call today. And if all of us were doing that, it's bigger and bigger and bigger. There's going to be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. And if all of us are doing tiny little things, it does add up. So that's how I try to feel as positive as I can about this. Oh, Vivekji, I will. I should share what I'm studying because it's relevant to why I have this say. Much like Mahati, this is a very close topic to me and what my interests are. I study agriculture, food, and environment at Tufts University, and I'm particularly interested in my study at the intersection of climate change mitigation and agriculture and food production. And so this is a topic that's very close to my heart. And to that point, I'll come to my question, Prakashji, which is, you had mentioned, you know, the carbon payments and carbon fees and how those would be redistributed. And in a lot of these programs throughout history, we see a lot of lack of justice in how this distribution happens, where those who are the most impacted or the most marginalized in our communities don't see the benefits. That particularly happens with concepts like environmental racism and environmental justice in general, and who gets the benefits of the, you know, carbon accounting or other climate change programs we have. And I'm curious as to the thoughts you've had about how we as activists and, you know, members of our community can make sure that we're not only standing up for what we want to see, but what those who will be most impacted and those whose voices are never heard, how do we speak up for them as well? I'm curious to hear how you've approached that in your career.
Thanks, Samson. Thanks for sharing about your background too. And I love your sweater. Yosemite is one of my favorite places on Earth. Grew up a few hours away from there. I didn't mention, I don't think it was mentioned in the introductions, that I did a career change after my gap year. I started teaching math at the local agricultural college. So at NC State University, they have College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and the university mainly awards bachelor's, master's, and PhDs degrees, but there's one department, the one that I work in, that awards associate's degrees in applied science. Basically, I teach math to farmers so that they can increase their yields and increase the profitability of their businesses. So I'd be really interested to hear more about your specific research, and please do reach out to me so we can talk more. Also, congrats on the effort that you made to reduce the food waste. And you're exactly right that every little action makes a difference. It makes a difference internally in our minds, in our hearts, reduces that agitation, gives us that feeling of peace that we've done everything that we can, and that's extremely important. I think that's the most important thing of all the information and knowledge I'm sharing today. If we can scale up our actions, that's even better, you know, through the use of social media or through the suggesting other friends and family to do something along the lines of what you've done. That is, you know, scaled activities are really critical. Last week in Balavihar, our Balavihar coordinator showed a video about how we can all change the settings on our smartphone so that the videos that we download from YouTube that are in lower definition, because we can't appreciate the high definition of the videos that come to our phone since the screen's so small, and then that will reduce the amount of bandwidth that the transmission of data that reduces will use less carbon, emit less carbon elsewhere. And so that, that action alone is not going to do squat in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But if millions and millions of people do it, now we're talking. Now it becomes an important. It makes a dent in the problem. And so that's scaling these actions is key to the extent that we can. And I went in so many circles on that response, I forgot the final question that you asked. I really apologize. It's getting past my bedtime as well. I usually sleep by 9:30. But you feel free to recap
no
it.
worries.
Yeah.
It was just regarding, so a lot of the initiatives to address climate change, it's, I think, sorry, there's a lot of joking going on in the chat. It's a little distracting. I should actually practice my focus right now. But there's a lot of part of the conversation around climate mitigation and, where carbon fees are redistributed and who pays them, where they go, what happens to them. But a lot of marginalized communities might not see the benefits. How do we address that as climate oriented?
Thank you. Yeah, bring me back to point. So it wasn't until very late in my education and actually my work at EPA that I started to realize what an issue environmental justice is. So I studied air pollution and learned about how to reduce emissions and how that will cut down air, PM 2.5 or ozone or whatever. Turns out that our, lowest income communities are right around the most polluted areas. And similarly, there's just like we have environmental injustice in this country and around the world. In India, it's really, really blatant. With the poorest, Zhopadpattis being right near the dumps, for example. There's another issue of climate injustice, right? So our lowest earning residents in the US are most vulnerable to climate extremes, right? If they don't, like some of our neighbors in Raleigh, they don't have heating and air conditioning. So when a heat wave hits and creates this statistical rise in deaths, they're the ones who are dying, right? They're having those premature mortalities because they don't have the means to cool themselves. They literally, their way of cooling down is to come out on the patio. But if it's 98 degrees and 100% humidity in North Carolina, they're not getting much relief. Carbon dividends are the most equitable way, I think, of ensuring that everybody gets a piece of the pie, right? Every single, it doesn't, depending on how the bill ends up being written and formulated, it wouldn't necessarily be restricted to citizens. It could be to every member, every American household. But that's going to certainly be debated. That'll be a political issue. But all of our, every member, whether they're paying a positive tax or getting, a tax credit, would be entitled to this dividend. And so I think it's one of the most equitable ways of sharing the revenues and the correction of this market failure. It appealed to me so much that I was able to talk to some of my low income neighbors about this solution and get them excited about it. What, you mean I'm going to get dividend, energy check every month, and it's going to be how much? And it's an easy sell, I would say, to the lower income folks if they can get over their years and decades of mistrust of the government.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much, Prakash. Thank you to everyone. We're going to do this again soon. Be well. Hari Om.